Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I really actually enjoyed Jeff's talk, and I hope it's going to, mine will kind of add something to that. Yeah, I'm really just going to share, I suppose, in a way, two stories. They both speak to the light and the dark, and they're from my particular historical and geographic context, which is South Africa. But I'm hoping that they will, share, speak to the theme of stories like now and some of the themes that others have explored. But just, to be honest up front, most of my work with stories in the background, so I'm not very comfortable in front of the screen and being on stage. So I have some cheat notes here just to help me along. So I hope you'll all forgive me.
We will, and we will enjoy, and we will listen. So thank you so much for coming. I am in the shadows. If you need me, call me. And thank you so much for coming.
No, thank you very much for having me. And I really, for me, this opportunity is a lighthouse, and I think this conference is a lighthouse for all of those of us who think about and dream about and live and are passionate about all things story. So, yeah, gratitude to you and your team.
Thank you so much. I'll be back for the Q&A, and I'm listening here.
Okay. So I'm going to start with the story. The sun is thrown into the sky. In the time of the first people, it was the children who put the sun into the sky and brought the light. Before then, the sun person was a man who lived on the earth. In the beginning, the sun person only gave light in the space around his home. And the light came from his armpits, and it was only when he lay sleeping with his arms lifted that there was light. In those times, the sky was dark. An old woman told the mothers that the children of the first people should take the sun person and throw him into the sky while he slept. She explained they should sit and wait for his eyes to close, and then, working together, throw him into the sky. She also said that the children should talk to the sun person while they were doing this, saying, "O grandfather sun person, rise into the sky and become the sun, which is hot, and take away the darkness. Travel across the sky, giving us your light, so that we may hunt. Make the Bushmen rice dry for us to eat, and allow us to visit one another." The children did as they were told. And from that day, the sun comes out and travels across the sky, and the darkness goes away. And when the sun sets, the darkness returns. But now, the first people could make a life on the earth. So this is part of an origin story of how the sun came to be in the sky, and it was shared by a man named ؐxarra, somewhere around 1870, in the region of about 150 years ago. Âxarra was a son or Bushman who spoke the Âxam language, and for those of you who don't know, the San people are hunter-gatherers and are the indigenous people or the first peoples of Southern Africa. They are also one of the oldest cultures in the world, dating anywhere from between 20 and 35,000 years ago, which makes them far older than the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans that I think many of us learned about at school. They're also one of the most successful cultures in human history in the way that they managed to live peacefully together, as well as in total harmony with their natural environment. never taking more than what they needed to survive, and or causing destruction to the natural world on which their lives depended. Now, Şxarra told this story of how people brought light to the world to Willem Bleek, who was a German linguist living in Cape Town, South Africa, in the mid 1800s, 1850 or thereabouts. And with the help of his sister-in-law, an English woman by the name of Lucy Lloyd, Bleek began to learn and write down the Şxam language, beginning with an alphabet, and then a list of words and phrases. And eventually, as they learned more and began to understand the stories and narratives about the history and the folklore and the beliefs and the customs of the Şxam. Now, the journey started when Bleek first visited some San who were being held as prisoners in various prisons around Cape Town in the 1850s. And his curiosity grew, and the interest eventually led to him getting permission to visit the prisoners and to learn their language. And later on, as this process continued, they even had permission for some of the Şxam, including Şxarra, who told this story, come and live with them, so that they might better understand the language and these people. Now, why am I telling you this? Why do I share this story as we think about stories that light now? Now, this is a saying from the Şxam language that Bleek and Lloyd managed to capture, and it translates directly to people who are different meet. People who are different meet. Now, personally, from a story perspective, I'm intrigued by this idea that comes from a people who lived in places where there were very few humans, and the humans that were there lived great distances apart. And I'm also wonder what the Şxam might have meant by this and the wisdom behind the saying, because sadly, darkness came for the Şxam people with the arrival of different people in South Africa. It is said that the last Şxam speaker and their culture died somewhere around the time of 1910. And from the 1870s, most of the traditional San who lived in the area around Cape Town were hunted and killed. And in the decades that followed, many more were shot, arrested, and made slaves by the European settlers and colonialists in what was really a physical and cultural genocide. And because of their seemingly primitive ways, they were given the name Bushmen for how they lived so basically in the wild. And the stories told about them created beliefs that these ancient people were actually closer to animals than human beings, which I think helped justify the violence that was done to them and to their way of life. In fact, the South African government even used to give people licenses to hunt the San, and some reports suggest that the last one was given in 1936. And I'd like you to think about that for a moment. A license to hunt another human being because the belief that this person was more animal than human, and as recently as 1936. And it didn't stop there, because South Africa would go deeper into darkness through the policy of apartheid. which I think many of you are familiar with, at least even if it's just in the word. Now, the word apartheid means to be apart or to be separate. And the system's vision was to keep different and diverse people physically apart from one another. And the success of the system was this forced physical separation. But more so, it was in the weaponization of the stories of us and them. You know, the kinds of stories that the system created and fed and told were about putting suspicion and fear and hate and even violence into the minds of people towards others, total strangers, people that they knew nothing about. It was a very dark time for South Africa, but luckily we had a lighthouse moment in 1994. And coming back to the sun, in 2000, the government chose to change the country's motto to ؐxarra, people who are different meet. And the intention behind the motto, or the intended meaning, was diverse people unite, or unity in diversity. And I think this choice was part of a bigger vision to change the South African narrative that up until then had been us and them, to one that was more embracing and more about we. And I think from a story perspective, one of the hardest tasks of the new government was to find this alternative and to really offer it as another way of being to the people of South Africa. And the push was really to move from the stories that enforced this idea of separateness and to open up spaces for stories that would allow us to think about togetherness. Because the wickedness of apartheid was really that it infected every aspect of life in South Africa. It found its way into every home, into every family, into every community. And it really had such an influence in the way that people thought about themselves, about each other, and therefore the behaviors and the actions that they had towards each other. Now, we were also lucky to have a lighthouse in Nelson Mandela, and I think he is really a metaphor and a shining light for those of us, for this country during that moment of transition. And this is interesting, especially considering that much of his life was shaped and dominated by the dark stories and the actions that they produced through the system of apartheid. But through his wisdom, he chose, him and the many others who led this change chose the alternative. They chose to embrace diversity. And he really lived and preached a message that all people had a place and that our differences were actually our strength and the real path to togetherness. That our humanity was shared and common and universal, even if our backgrounds and our cultures and our languages were different. I think this way of being, this narrative, this story that was told again and again, opened spaces for different people to meet and to discover each other in ways that we just were not allowed to before. One tool in this process, another lighthouse, I guess, was this concept of Ubuntu, which again, some of you might be familiar with. But basically, Ubuntu comes from a saying that is found in many of the indigenous languages in this part of the world, which translates to a person is a person through other people. And the essence of Ubuntu says that my humanity is dependent on your humanity. And so if I deny you your humanity, I'm also denying myself my own humanity. And so we're locked into this mutual destruction. And at a personal level, one of the hardest journeys I've had to make as a person growing up in this country and this history and, you know, this background of the stories and narratives is to wrestle with this story of separateness in myself. I've had to face, you know, the stories that I've been told about different people, people who are different from me. Stories I may even have believed or accepted just because I didn't know any better. Stories about people I had never met. And I think, you know, this South African story really highlights the power of narrative and story, and the impact that it can have on our lives. Luckily for me, my time working in journalism and storytelling, I've also had the privilege to travel this diverse country and into the diverse communities and spaces that we have. You know, work that's taken me into prisons, into communities struggling with gangs and drugs and violence, and even into spaces where people live in ways that no human being should ever have to. And always in the beginning, I had my own stories that I took with me into those spaces about the people that I would meet and about what their lives were like. And always, you know, after being there and having the experience, I always came back realizing that these stories were untrue. They were not my stories. They were somebody else's, that I had just internalized because of hearing them again and again and again. And I think just by meeting people, by being curious, by being able to ask questions, by being able to listen to and share stories, I found that these were people just like me. You know, that the stories of their hopes and dreams, of their fears and their pains, their lived experiences, they were reflections of my own story, even if the details are different. So I think for me, one thing I've taken away from that is that maybe the deep experiences of stories about the dark actually help us to see the light. Because after all, if there was no darkness, there would be no light, no lighthouses. And, you know, now that I'm talking about this notion of darkness, I'd like to introduce another concept from here called uluvivi. Now, uluvivi is a word that comes from the Zulu language, and it means the darkness at its most intense. You know, that time of night just before the rising of the sun. And I first learned about this word, uluvivi, while reading the book, The Elephant Whisperer, learning about life, loyalty, and freedom from a remarkable herd of elephants by a man named Lawrence Anthony. Now, Lawrence Anthony was passionate about nature and wildlife, and this led him to buying his own wildlife reserve. But I think in his life, there was a great story moment, or a lighthouse moment even, when he received a call from a group of conservationists about a herd of 9 wild elephants that were considered a problem. Now, these elephants, they kept escaping from the places that they were being held and then going out into areas where people lived. And so the conservationists said that they either needed to be captured and relocated, Otherwise, the other only alternative would be to shoot them. Now, the herd were traumatized elephants, the descendants of elephants that had been hunted, with some of the older members of the herd even having witnessed their own family members being killed. And because of this, you can imagine their trust of human beings was non-existent. But Anthony managed over a number of years to gain their trust and successfully then release the elephants back into the wild, where they still live and thrive today. So coming back to Uluvivi, it's mentioned a number of times in the book, and particularly in those early moments when the elephants were first brought to Anthony's Wildlife Reserve. And for some months they had to be kept in a cage, a specially built cage or enclosure that was made for them, just to help them in the process of adapting to their new environment before they could be released into the wild. And interestingly, the elephants tried to escape and were even successful once or twice. But interestingly, they chose this time of Uluvivi, when the darkness was at its most intense, as the moment to do this. And it was also almost as if by some inner wisdom that they knew that time between dark and light was the best opportunity for freedom. Now, Anthony goes on to write about the importance of Uluvivi in the customs, beliefs, and worldview of the Zulus. And I'd like to share with you a little passage from the book that I think describes it well. Most rural Zulus believe that spirits in countless forms are very busily involved in the destiny of man, that they take form in the plant and animal kingdoms, and that the rivers, skies, and mountains are inhabited by supernatural beings. They believe that after death, there is no heavenly reward or hellish punishment, only the transformation to an ancestor, from where one continues a never-ending role in the eternal dance between the spiritual and material worlds. These beliefs are poorly understood and too easily laughed at by many Westerners who think they know best. That is, of course, until you turn out the lights. For there is nothing like darkness, nothing like experiencing night in the African bush with rural Africans who know strange stories to lead your spirit down the same roads. For surely it was not civilization that eroded the spirit world. It was the electric light at night, the light that took away the dark, blinded us to ghosts, angels, and demons, and vanquished our ancestors. So that's pretty much me. But in conclusion, I wanted to leave you with some last reflections as we think about light and dark in the context of stories like now. And the first for me is following that story of the first people's children throwing the sun into the sky. Darkness was there before the light. Also, people were the ones to bring the light. And they only did this by coming together. And then even when the sun lit the sky, there was still darkness and an ongoing dance between the worlds of light and dark. Darkness, or Uluvivi, is also a moment of great possibility. For the elephants, it was a time of escape to freedom. For traditional Zulus, it is a time when spirits and our ancestors are hard at work in our lives, even though unseen. And so maybe there is also magic in darkness that we may have forgotten in our focus on the light. And then lastly, that when different people meet, there is always the potential for story. Our choice is whether we choose stories that feed separate or together. Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you so much for sharing so many wisdom from your culture. It's lovely to. I have never heard of the concept of this space between light and dark. Thank you for sharing that. Wow. All right. So if you have any questions you want Howard to elaborate on, please share them in the chat. For now on, there are just admirations. I hope you see them.
I do. Thank you.
Oh, and we have a great question from Adel. Do we choose stories that focus on separate or together? Like, I mean, if I get that right, I mean, it's preferable. Is it preferable to tell the stories based on what Adel is coming from? In your view, what stories are better to tell? The consequences of being separate or the benefits of being together? Is there a difference, and maybe they are similar or different to each other?
That's a tough question for me to answer. I guess it's perhaps going back to what Jeff was saying earlier, rather than to be too prescriptive, we allow the story to bring what it needs to us, and it will mean different things to different people. I guess in the South African experience, those, after moving through apartheid into the country that we now live in, it was important to tell those stories of the darkness, of the separateness, because I think it helped us, like a lighthouse, know where we had come from, but also acting then as a compass for us to now navigate this new space of trying to find each other, of trying to explore what stories of togetherness might mean, because there was no roadmap, and I think that was really the result of just really visionary leadership on the part of people like Nelson Mandela, to know that if we let the darkness define us, then that would become our future. But if we made space between people to meet, to come together, that's where the moments of light are possible, and that's where the seeds of a new and different future come from.
Lovely. We are defined by what we let define us. Awesome. Thank you. We have one more. What level of trust do you need to let stories of dark be told so we can see magic? Interesting questions, Ladle. Thank you so much.
Sure. That's another tough one. I wonder if it begins with trust. I wonder if maybe it doesn't begin with maybe curiosity, or at least a willingness to listen to the other. I think trust comes from that. If we are given the space to share story, to share our stories, and then allow other people to have the space to share their stories, we might not like we might not like the other person, and we might not like the stories that they have to share, but I think at least that willingness creates a space, and I think maybe in that space, that's where trust can grow. I'm curious. Maybe I could ask you that question, Artem. You for me are a very curious storyteller. I wonder what you think.
Oh, that's the You've turned the table on me. Okay. I believe that the trust only forms when we allow it to form. There was this short bit that I always show on leadership training from Indiana Jones. I don't remember the name of the part, but it was about when they were looking for this ancient artifact that granted immortality. I don't know the name in English. And there comes a part where he gets to, like, there's a maze and he goes through it, and finally there is just this gap. He's in a cave, and the like 10-meter gap behind, like in front of him. And the guide that he's reaching says, "Step into the abyss, and you will be carried by your faith." And he steps there, and suddenly a bridge appears, and the camera moves away, and we can see that there's this 3D print, like 3D picture, which is invisible from a certain angle. And for me, this is a great representation of what trust is all about. You first trust the process. You start by telling stories from the dark, and from this darkness, the light arises. It's like the yin and yang. There is never darkness without the light, just like you said. You need to find the courage to step into the darkness and let the light emerge.
Yeah, and I mean, I love you bringing that idea of the bridge. And I mean, for me, I think stories are really those bridges between people. Especially, I think, as Jeff was saying, dream big, but tell small stories. And it's the small stories we tell each other and we share with each other in our daily life that create bridges. It opens our eyes to other possibilities, other worlds, other ways of thinking and doing things. And I think that's really where in those small sharings, those small stories is where the seeds of big change and big shifts are planted.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I like that we've been acquainted by the conference that was themed as bridges. So that's a great continuation of it. Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. All right. So, Howard, I'm going to ask you one more question. That's a traditional one. And I would love to hear your response on this. So one story is a lighthouse, as you heard, and many stories are like many lighthouses that can light up the world. What story would you like for more people to tell so the world will be brighter?
Sure. I don't know if I'd say one story. I guess it's
a kind of story or a topic of stories that you would like to be heard.
I think it goes back to different people meeting and sharing their stories. I think those small moments of exchange are really where big transformation can happen. Deep connections are made. Our ideas about other people are challenged. I think we live in a time where we have all these, as human beings, we have all these big narratives that really invite us to think about separateness, about us and them. But I think, in those small personal tellings, sharing about yourself with a person that is maybe a stranger to you or somebody who doesn't know you well. I think those sharings are really where magic can happen. And I think, yeah, for me, the faith is not in the big grand stories. It's in the small ones between ordinary people. Stories that might have extraordinary impacts in small and big ways. Yeah, Artem, we can't hear you.
And I'm talking into the abyss. All right, okay. I was just saying that it's beautiful, and the fact that I forgot to turn on the microphone says it all for me. Thank you so much for your reply, and thank you so much for bringing your light to the conference. It was amazing.
Thank you for being the lighthouse for all of us to gather around. So very grateful for that.
Thank you so much. All right, we will be moving to our last chapter, but before we do, I think it's very... there is a quote I would like to read to you from Nelson Mandela, which really resonates with me and with the talk that's just happened. And I don't remember it word by word, but I would like you to hear it because it's really related to the topic, and it just came up in my mind. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is not our darkness that frightens us. It is our light. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are the child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to manifest the glory of God and the light that is within us. It is not just in some of us. It is in every one of us. As we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give others permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our fear, our presence automatically liberates others. I believe this kind of attitude towards our own strengths, towards our own journey, can really liberate others as long as we tell it from the perspective that serves people well. And I didn't really know that he borrowed it from Marianne Williamson. Jeff, thank you so much. You've been enlightening me whole evening. Thank you so much.